The night the boy broke in, the ocean was quiet, the kind of silence that settles over a place where money has already solved every problem it knows how to solve. The house stood tall above the shoreline, glass walls reflecting nothing but darkness, security lights cutting through the night like watchful eyes that had never failed before. Inside, everything was controlled, measured, protected. And yet, just past midnight, a small figure slipped through the gates barefoot, unnoticed, carrying nothing, taking nothing, moving with a kind of purpose that didn't belong to someone who had nowhere to go. His name was Caleb, and at 12 years old, he had already learned how to survive in a world that rarely noticed him. But what he was about to do that night had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with something far more human, something that would reach beyond logic, beyond reason, and straight into a place that even the most powerful man in the city could no longer access. Everyone who reviewed the footage later saw the same thing at first glance: a trespasser, a risk, a mistake in a system that was built to prevent exactly this kind of moment. The assumption came easily because it always does. A homeless boy entering a billionaire's property could only mean one thing: desperation mixed with opportunity, hunger meeting excess. But what the cameras captured next didn't fit any pattern they were used to analyzing. Because instead of searching for doors or windows or anything of value, Caleb walked straight across the garden, past sculptures worth more than most people's homes, past security blind spots that should have triggered alarms but didn't, as if the night itself had decided to let him pass, and stopped only when he reached a wide glass window where a girl sat alone in a wheelchair, her eyes fixed on nothing, her body still in a way that felt heavier than silence, as though time had paused around her and simply refused to move forward. Her name was Emily Lawson, and for nearly 2 years, she had not spoken a word, not to the doctors who came and went with quiet confidence, not to the therapists who promised progress, not even to her father, Daniel Lawson, a man whose entire life had been built on solving problems, fixing what was broken, turning loss into strategy and risk into reward. He had built an empire from the ground up, rising through industries that demanded precision and control, and he had done it all with the belief that anything could be managed if you understood it well enough. But Emily was different because there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to rebuild, nothing to optimize. She had once been full of movement, laughter that filled every room, energy that made even the quietest spaces feel alive. But after the accident that took her mother and left her unable to walk, something inside her had closed off in a way no one could reach, and Daniel, for all his wealth and influence, found himself standing in a world where none of it mattered. And then, on that night, as Caleb stood outside that glass, looking in at a girl he had never met, something shifted in a way that no report, no expert, no explanation could fully capture, because instead of knocking, instead of calling out, instead of doing anything that would make sense to the people who would later try to understand it, he simply stepped back, took a breath, and began to move. There was no music, no audience, no reason that could be easily explained, just a boy dancing in the quiet of the night, his movements unpolished but filled with intention, each step carrying a kind of expression that didn't ask for attention but offered something instead, something fragile and honest. Something that didn't belong to the world of wealth or survival, but to something deeper that both he and the girl inside the house understood in ways no one else could see. Inside, Emily's gaze shifted for the first time in months, slowly, almost uncertain, as if her mind needed to confirm that what she was seeing was real, and for a moment that would later be replayed over and over again, analyzed and questioned and remembered. Her expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would make headlines or immediate conclusions, but just enough to suggest that something long buried had stirred, something small but undeniable. And upstairs, watching from a balcony he often stood on when sleep refused to come, Daniel Lawson saw it too, though at first he didn't understand what he was looking at, only that something about the scene below didn't align with the world he had spent his entire life mastering. Because this wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not in a place designed to eliminate uncertainty, not in a life structured around control, and yet in that moment, everything he believed about power, about influence, about what truly mattered, began to shift in a way he could neither stop nor ignore. As a boy with nothing stood in front of everything he owned, and reached a part of his daughter that no amount of money had been able to find. And what happened next would not only challenge everything Daniel thought he understood about the world, but would force him to confront a question he had spent years avoiding, a question that no business deal, no strategy, no success could answer, because for the first time, the solution to his greatest problem didn't come from power, but from something far simpler, something he had long overlooked, something that had found its way into his life in the quietest, most unexpected way imaginable. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this child? And why did he risk everything for a girl he had never met? A girl whose world had been silent for so long that even hope had learned to keep its distance. And yet here he was, standing on the other side of a glass wall that separated two completely different lives, moving as if he understood something no one else did, something that couldn't be taught, bought, or explained through logic alone. Caleb wasn't supposed to be there, not in a place like this, not within reach of a system designed to detect even the smallest disruption. And yet he had passed through it, as if the barriers themselves had failed to recognize him, raising a question that would later trouble everyone who tried to make sense of that night, because nothing about his presence followed the rules that governed Daniel Lawson's world, and nothing about his actions matched the expectations that came with it. Daniel stood above, watching, his instincts telling him to act, to call security, to stop whatever this was before it turned into something worse, because that's what he had always done: respond quickly, eliminate risk, maintain control. But something held him in place, something unfamiliar that didn't fit into the framework he had relied on his entire life. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't confusion. It was something quieter, something that made him hesitate in a way he hadn't in years. Because as he watched Caleb move, watched the way Emily's eyes followed him with a faint trace of awareness that hadn't been there before, he realized that stepping in might mean interrupting something he didn't fully understand, something that, for the first time in a long time, felt important in a way that had nothing to do with money or power. And then there was the question of how a barefoot boy with no access, no resources, no connection to this world had managed to get inside a property that had been secured down to the smallest detail, a place where every entry point was monitored, every movement tracked, every vulnerability accounted for. Or at least that's what Daniel had believed until this moment forced him to reconsider everything he thought was certain. Because Caleb didn't move like someone who had stumbled in by chance, and he didn't act like someone who was afraid of being caught. There was intention in every step, a quiet confidence that suggested this wasn't random, and yet there was no clear explanation, no immediate answer that could make sense of it. The simplest explanation would have been that he was a thief, that this was a calculated risk driven by desperation, but nothing about his behavior supported that. He wasn't searching, wasn't hiding, wasn't taking anything. Instead, he was giving something, offering something without asking for anything in return, and that alone made the situation harder to define, because it didn't align with the way people understood the world, especially in a place like this where every action usually had a clear purpose tied to gain or loss. And if it wasn't theft, then what was it? What could possibly bring a child from the streets to the private space of a girl he had never known and compel him to move the way he did, with a kind of focus that ignored everything else around him? As the minutes passed, the questions only grew heavier, not lighter, because the more Daniel watched, the more he realized that this moment wasn't as simple as it appeared, and whatever was unfolding in front of him carried consequences he couldn't yet see, consequences that would extend far beyond this single night. Because in the next 24 hours, the answers to these questions would begin to surface, slowly, unexpectedly, and in ways that would challenge every assumption he had made, not just about Caleb, but about himself, about his daughter, and about the life he thought he understood so well. And by the time it was over, nothing would remain exactly as it was before. Richard Lawson didn't believe in luck, not the kind people use to explain success or failure, not the kind that made things easier to accept when life refused to follow a plan, because from the very beginning, his life had been defined by something else entirely, something far less forgiving and far more demanding: control. He grew up in a small town where opportunities were limited and expectations even more so, where most people learned to settle early and call it stability. But Richard had always seen things differently, not because he was given more, but because he refused to accept less. Every decision he made carried intention. Every risk was calculated. Every setback studied and turned into something useful. And over time, that mindset built something extraordinary, a business empire that stretched across industries, a reputation that commanded respect, and a life that, from the outside, looked like the result of perfect execution. He became the kind of man people pointed to as proof that discipline and focus could overcome anything, the kind of man who didn't leave room for uncertainty, who believed that if you understood a problem deeply enough, you could solve it, reshape it, or remove it entirely. And for years, that belief held true in boardrooms, in negotiations, in decisions that carried millions of dollars in consequence. He remained steady, composed, always a step ahead, always in control. But the part of his life that mattered most to him had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with power or influence. It was his family, his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Amanda, the one place where control wasn't about winning, but about protecting, providing, and being present in ways that no amount of success could replace. Amanda had always been the center of that world, full of energy, full of life, the kind of child who didn't just enter a room but transformed it, whose laughter carried through the house like something alive, something that reminded everyone around her that joy didn't need a reason. She loved music in a way that felt natural, instinctive, as if it was part of her language, and she would dance without hesitation, without thinking about how she looked or who might be watching, just moving because it felt right, because it made her feel free. Richard often found himself watching her from a distance, not as the man who controlled everything, but as a father who understood that some of the most important things in life couldn't be controlled at all, only appreciated while they lasted. Then one night, everything stopped, not gradually, not in a way that allowed time to adjust, but suddenly, completely, in a moment that divided their lives into before and after with no way back. The accident happened on a quiet road, the kind of place where nothing unusual ever seemed to occur, and yet in a matter of seconds, everything changed. Claire was gone, taken in a way that left no time for goodbye, and Amanda, who had once moved so freely, was left unable to walk, her body present, but her spirit pulled somewhere far away, somewhere no one could reach. For Richard, it was the first problem in his life that refused to respond to effort, to money, to influence. No matter how much he invested, no matter how many specialists he brought in, no matter how many doors he opened, the outcome remained the same. He could rebuild companies, restructure failing systems, turn losses into gains, but he couldn't fix this. He couldn't bring back his wife, and he couldn't bring back the version of his daughter that had filled their home with life. And over time, something changed in Amanda that went beyond the physical, something deeper, something harder to define. She stopped speaking, not gradually, not in a way that suggested recovery might still be possible, but completely, as if a part of her had decided that words were no longer necessary or no longer worth the effort. Doctors offered explanations, therapists offered strategies, each one confident in their approach, each one certain that progress would come with time, but weeks turned into months, and months into years, and nothing changed. Richard adapted the only way he knew how, by building structure around the problem, by creating routines, by ensuring that every possible resource was available. But even he began to understand that what Amanda needed wasn't something he could provide through control alone. He spent nights walking through the house, pausing outside her room, listening to the quiet that had replaced everything that once made it feel like home. And for the first time in his life, he found himself facing something he couldn't solve, something that didn't respond to effort or intention, something that simply existed beyond his reach. And then, on a night that began like any other, with the same silence, the same unanswered questions, and the same weight that had settled over their lives, something unexpected entered that world, something small, uninvited, and impossible to predict, a presence that didn't belong to their reality and yet found its way into it without resistance, without explanation. Because that was the night a stranger appeared, and with him came the first shift in a story that had remained unchanged for far too long. The official report would later describe it as a system anomaly, a brief disruption in the security network that lasted just long enough to go unnoticed in real time, but clear enough to raise questions after the fact. Because for a property like Richard Lawson's, There were no simple oversights, no gaps left unchecked, no moments where attention simply drifted away without consequence. And yet, on that night, the alarms flickered, not loudly, not in a way that demanded immediate response, but just enough to shift the system into a state of quiet confusion, a delay measured in seconds that created an opening no one had planned for and no one immediately recognized. The guards, positioned strategically across the estate, followed routine patterns, their focus directed toward the outer perimeter where threats were expected, where risks were predictable, and for that brief window, the center of it all, the place that mattered most, remained unguarded in a way that defied everything Richard had invested in preventing exactly this kind of moment. Caleb moved through that opening without hesitation, not rushing, not pausing, but walking with a steady rhythm that suggested he wasn't afraid of being seen, only focused on where he needed to be. There was no sign of panic in him, no urgency that usually accompanies someone crossing a boundary they shouldn't, just a quiet determination that didn't ask for permission and didn't seem concerned with consequences. He passed through spaces designed to intimidate, past structures built to reinforce distance between people like him and people like Richard Lawson, and yet none of it slowed him down, none of it changed the direction he had already chosen. By the time the system corrected itself, by the time the guards resumed full awareness, he was already inside the inner grounds, standing within reach of a world he had no logical reason to enter. It was Amanda who saw him first, before anyone else, before the systems, before the people responsible for protecting the estate, her gaze shifting slightly toward the glass, as if something beyond her usual silence had called her attention outward. There was no fear in her expression, no sign of alarm, only a quiet curiosity that hadn't been seen in her for a very long time, as though the presence of this unfamiliar figure didn't register as a threat, but as something else entirely, something that interrupted the stillness she had been living in without warning. She didn't move much, just enough to acknowledge that he was there, just enough to suggest that the moment had reached her in a way nothing else had in months. Caleb stopped when he saw her, not surprised, not uncertain, just aware, as if this was the moment he had been moving toward all along. For a brief second, the world between them felt suspended, separated by glass but connected by something neither of them could fully explain, and then, without any signal, without any preparation, he stepped back and began to move. There was no music guiding him, no rhythm except the one he carried within himself, no performance meant to impress or entertain, just motion that came from somewhere deeper, something instinctive, something that didn't need explanation to exist. His movements were simple but intentional, each step forming a language that didn't rely on words, each motion carrying meaning that couldn't be translated but could be felt. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to be seen in the way performers usually are, seeking validation or attention. He was reaching across a space that had remained untouched for too long, reaching towards someone who had withdrawn from everything around her, offering something without knowing if it would be received. And for a moment, nothing happened. The silence remained, the distance unchanged, the world exactly as it had been before he arrived. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Amanda's fingers moved slightly against the armrest of her wheelchair, a small motion that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching closely. Her eyes focusing just a little more, her expression changing in a way that was easy to miss but impossible to ignore once seen. It wasn't a full reaction, not a return to who she once was, not even a clear sign of recovery, but it was something that hadn't been there before, something that broke through the stillness just enough to suggest that it wasn't permanent after all. And above them, watching from the balcony where he had stood so many nights before, Richard Lawson saw it happen in real time, saw the smallest shift create the largest question he had faced since the night everything changed. Because for the first time in years, something changed, and it didn't come from the systems he built, or the people he hired, or the solutions he trusted. It came from a boy who had nothing, who wasn't supposed to be there, who had entered his world without permission and reached a place no one else had been able to reach. And in that moment, as the distance between what he believed and what he was witnessing began to close, Richard realized that whatever this was, it wasn't over, it was only beginning. The moment passed faster than anyone expected, as if whatever had been allowed to happen had reached its limit, and the world that Richard Lawson trusted so completely rushed in to correct itself. The security system stabilized, alerts began to register properly, and within seconds the guards were moving, voices breaking through the silence that had held everything together just moments before. By the time they reached the inner grounds, the space in front of the glass was empty, the boy gone without a trace, leaving behind no clear direction, no obvious path, nothing that could immediately explain how he had entered or where he had disappeared to. The cameras were pulled, the footage reviewed in real time, and yet even with all the angles, all the technology, there were gaps, small but significant, moments where visibility dropped just enough to break continuity, just enough to make the sequence feel incomplete. The initial reaction was predictable, a breach, a failure, a situation that needed to be contained and understood as quickly as possible, because for a man like Richard, uncertainty wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unacceptable. Orders were given, the perimeter tightened, additional personnel brought in to review every inch of the property, every possible entry point examined again with a level of scrutiny that bordered on obsession. But beneath that response, beneath the structure and urgency, something else remained, something that didn't fit the language of security reports or procedural analysis. Because while everyone else focused on how the boy got in, Richard couldn't ignore what had happened while he was there. The shift in Amanda, the smallest movement that had broken through months of silence, a moment that refused to be categorized as coincidence. The investigation began with the obvious questions. Who was he? Where did he come from? And how did he bypass a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion? Faces from nearby areas were pulled into databases, local reports reviewed, security teams expanding their search beyond the property, into streets and neighborhoods that rarely intersected with Richard's world. There were theories almost immediately, suggestions that the boy might be part of something larger, that this wasn't random, that it could have been a test, a distraction, even a setup designed to expose weaknesses in a system people assumed was impenetrable. The idea of a coordinated effort gained attention quickly because it provided a structure, a way to make sense of what otherwise felt unexplainable. But the deeper they looked, the less those theories held, because nothing about Caleb aligned with that level of planning. There were no connections, no patterns linking him to any group, no indication that he had the resources or support needed to carry out something so precise. Instead, what began to surface painted a very different picture, one that was far simpler and far harder to accept within the framework Richard had built his life around. Witnesses from nearby streets began to describe a boy who spent his time moving through public spaces unnoticed, not asking for money, not causing trouble, just dancing, sometimes on sidewalks, sometimes near intersections, always alone, always focused in a way that suggested he wasn't performing for anyone but himself. The reports were consistent, a child with no fixed home, no clear guardian, surviving in a way that relied more on instinct than structure, someone who existed on the edges of a city that rarely stopped to see him. And yet, despite that reality, there was something about him that didn't fit the assumptions people were quick to make, because those who had seen him before didn't describe desperation. They described something else, something quieter, something that made his presence feel different even in places where people like him were often ignored. The more information came in, the clearer it became that this wasn't planned, not in the way people initially believed, not in a way that could be traced back to intent beyond the moment itself. For Richard, that realization didn't bring relief, it brought conflict, because if this wasn't a threat, if this wasn't an attempt to exploit a weakness, then what was it? And more importantly, why had it reached his daughter in a way nothing else had? His first instinct remained, to protect, to reinforce, to ensure that nothing like this could happen again. But that instinct was now competing with something unfamiliar, something that made him hesitate before giving the final order to lock everything down completely. Anger was there, of course, directed at the breach, at the failure, at the fact that someone had entered his world without permission. But beneath that anger was something harder to define, something that kept pulling his attention back to that single moment, that single change he had witnessed with his own eyes. He reviewed the footage himself, not as a businessman analyzing risk, but as a father searching for answers, watching every frame with a level of focus that went beyond logic, looking for something he might have missed the first time. And as the sequence played again, slower now, more deliberate, He began to notice details that hadn't stood out before, small things that didn't align with the conclusions everyone else was reaching. The way Caleb moved, not like someone afraid of being caught, but like someone guided by something internal. The way Amanda responded, subtle but undeniable, and most of all, the timing of it all, the exact moment where everything shifted. And then, in a frame that lasted less than a second, something appeared that no one had mentioned, something so small it could have been dismissed as irrelevant. But to Richard, it changed the direction of everything that came next. Because what he saw in that moment wasn't just a boy dancing, and it wasn't just his daughter reacting. It was something else entirely, something no one expected, something that suggested this wasn't the first time their paths had come close to crossing. And that realization carried a weight that went far beyond a single night. What Richard Lawson saw in that single frame didn't look significant at first, just a detail buried in motion, easy to overlook unless you were searching for something more than answers, unless you were searching for meaning. It was a reflection in the glass, faint but clear enough when paused, showing a moment from earlier that same evening, hours before the break-in was even detected. Amanda had been sitting near the window as she often did, her gaze distant, her presence quiet, but outside, far beyond the gates, across the stretch of road that separated two completely different worlds, there had been movement, a small figure passing by, slowing down just enough to notice her, just enough to stop, if only for a second. It was Caleb, long before he stepped onto the property, long before anyone realized he would become part of their story, standing at a distance where he shouldn't have been able to see clearly. And yet something about that moment had been enough. The footage continued, showing him lingering for a few seconds longer than anyone else would have, not staring in curiosity, not reacting in confusion, but observing in a way that suggested recognition, as if what he saw in Amanda connected to something he already understood, something that didn't need explanation. And then he moved on, disappearing from view, just another unnoticed presence in a city that moved too fast to remember faces like his. But now, looking back, that moment felt different, because it meant that what happened later that night wasn't random, it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't driven by impulse alone. It meant that Caleb had seen Amanda before, had chosen to return, and had made a decision that no one had asked him to make. As the investigation shifted, the focus moved from how he entered to who he really was, and what began to surface told a story that no one in Richard's world was prepared to hear, because it didn't come with structure or certainty. It came in fragments, in small pieces gathered from people who had crossed paths with him briefly, from places where records weren't kept and lives weren't documented in ways that made them easy to trace. Caleb had lost his family years earlier, not in a single moment that could be easily explained, but in a series of events that left him alone, without a fixed place to belong, without anyone to guide him through what came next. He adapted the only way he could, learning to survive in spaces that offered little support, relying on instinct, on awareness, on the ability to move through the world without drawing attention. But there was one constant in his life that didn't fade, something that stayed with him even when everything else changed, and that was movement. Dance not as performance, not as a skill taught or refined, but as a way to process what couldn't be put into words, a way to release something that had nowhere else to go. People who had seen him before described it in simple terms, a boy who danced alone, not for money, not for recognition, but because it seemed to be the only way he knew how to hold on to something that was slipping away. And within that, there was a detail that didn't surface immediately, something that took longer to uncover, something that connected him to Amanda in a way no one could have predicted. There had been someone in his life, someone important enough to leave a mark that didn't fade with time, a younger sister who had shared that same love for movement, that same instinct to express joy through motion, someone who had been full of life in a way that reminded him of what the world could feel like before it changed. And when she was gone, when that part of his life ended, the silence that followed didn't just take her presence, it took something from him as well, something that he couldn't replace, only remember. So when he saw Amanda sitting there, still, distant, removed from everything around her, it wasn't just a stranger he was looking at, it was a reflection of something he had already lost, a reminder of a connection that had been taken from him without warning. And in that moment, something inside him made a decision, not one based on logic or expectation, but something simpler, something driven by a need to reach out in the only way he knew how. He wasn't dancing for attention, he wasn't dancing for money, he was trying to bring her back to life in the only language he had left, hoping that somewhere beneath the silence, something might respond the way it once had for someone else. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't a strategy, it was an instinct, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, what had worked once could work again, even if the world around him had given no reason to believe it would. And when Richard watched the footage again, now with that understanding, the moment that followed felt heavier, more significant than it had the first time, because what he saw wasn't just movement, it was connection, something fragile but real, something that existed beyond explanation. Amanda's expression shifted, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. her lips moving just enough to form something that hadn't been seen in a very long time. A small, almost imperceptible smile that carried more weight than any progress report, more meaning than any diagnosis. It wasn't a full return, it wasn't a complete change, but it was enough to prove that something inside her was still there, still reachable, still capable of responding when the right moment found its way through. And for Richard Lawson, that realization didn't just answer questions, it created new ones. Because if a boy with nothing could reach his daughter in a way that no expert had been able to, then everything he believed about control, about solutions, about the limits of what was possible, would have to be reconsidered in ways he had never allowed himself to imagine before. By the time the truth began to settle into something Richard Lawson could no longer ignore, the question was no longer about how Caleb got in. It was about why he had been allowed to leave without a trace, and more importantly, why Richard himself had let that happen. For a man who had built his entire life on decisive action, on closing gaps and eliminating uncertainty the moment it appeared, his hesitation that night stood out as something he couldn't easily justify, not to his team, and certainly not to himself. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that what he had witnessed wasn't something that could be contained by force or corrected through procedure. It required understanding, something he had spent most of his life replacing with control. And so, for the first time in years, Richard made a decision that didn't come from strategy, but from something far more personal. He chose to find the boy, not as a threat to be removed, but as a question that needed an answer. The search extended beyond the systems he trusted, beyond the networks that had always delivered results, into places that operated on a different kind of awareness, where people recognized faces instead of names, and stories traveled through conversation rather than records. It didn't take long before the same descriptions surfaced again. A boy who moved through the city quietly, who didn't ask for anything but still left an impression on those who noticed him. And eventually, that trail led to a place where Richard Lawson had likely never set foot before, a stretch of pavement where the boundaries between stability and survival were thin and constantly shifting. And there, among people who had learned to exist without guarantees, he saw him again. Caleb, moving the same way he had that night, focused, distant, unaware that the man watching him now had spent days trying to understand a moment that had lasted only minutes. Their first real interaction didn't carry the tension one might expect. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no immediate demand for explanation. Just a quiet exchange of presence. Two lives from completely different worlds meeting in a space that didn't belong to either of them. Richard approached carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for something he didn't yet fully understand. And when Caleb looked at him, there was no sign of guilt, no attempt to run, only recognition, as if he had expected this moment to come, even if he didn't know when or how. And in that silence, Richard found himself asking a question that went beyond the surface of what had happened, a question that carried everything he had been trying to process since that night. Not why did you break in, but why did you stop? Why did you choose her? Why did that moment matter enough for you to risk everything? The answers didn't come in long explanations or carefully structured responses. They came in simple words, in fragments that carried more meaning than their length suggested, and within them, Richard began to see the connection he had missed before, the loss that shaped Caleb's actions, the memory that guided him, and the reason he had returned to a place he had no reason to enter. It wasn't about crossing boundaries, it wasn't about defying systems, it was about reaching something that felt familiar, something that reminded him of what he had lost, and trying, in his own way, to bring it back, even if only for a moment. That understanding changed everything, not instantly, not in a way that erased the complexity of the situation, but enough to shift the direction of what came next. Richard made a choice that no one around him expected. He invited Caleb back, not as an intruder, not as a risk to be monitored, but as someone who might hold a piece of something they had been unable to find on their own. It wasn't a decision made lightly, and it didn't come without hesitation, but it came with a sense of clarity that had been missing for a long time, a willingness to step outside the structure that had defined his life and allow something unfamiliar to take its place. When Caleb returned, the environment was different, not because the space had changed, but because the intention behind it had. There were no barriers this time, no glass separating him from Amanda, no distance enforced by design, just a quiet room where two lives that had intersected once were given the chance to meet again under different circumstances. And this time, there was music, soft at first, almost hesitant, filling the space in a way that felt both new and familiar, creating a rhythm that hadn't existed the night before. Caleb moved again, but it wasn't the same as before. There was more confidence now, more connection, as if the moment had expanded beyond what it had been, as if it had been given permission to grow into something more. Amanda's response came slowly, just as it had the first time, but this time it didn't stop at a single shift. Her eyes followed more closely, her expression changed more clearly, and for a brief moment that carried more weight than anyone in that room could fully process, her hand lifted slightly, responding not just to the movement, but to the music, to the presence, to something that had found its way back to her through a path no one had anticipated. It wasn't a complete recovery, it wasn't a resolution in the way people often expect, but it was progress, real and undeniable, something that proved that the silence she had lived in was not absolute, that something within her was still capable of reaching outward when given the right connection. And for Richard Lawson, standing there watching something unfold that no amount of planning could have created, the realization settled in quietly but firmly that some things, no matter how much you try to control them, exist outside the systems we build, outside the structures we rely on, beyond the influence of money, power, or strategy. Some things cannot be bought, cannot be forced, cannot be solved in the ways we are taught to expect, but sometimes, in ways we don't understand, they find us anyway, arriving through paths we would never choose, carried by people we would never expect, and leaving behind changes that no system could ever replicate. In the days that followed, the mansion no longer felt like a place defined only by silence and control, because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be reversed, not completely, not back to what it once was. The routines were still there, the structure remained, but there was now a presence within it that didn't come from systems or schedules, something that existed in the quiet moments between them, something that reminded Richard Lawson that not every solution comes from planning, and not every breakthrough follows a path we can predict. Amanda continued to respond in small ways, not all at once, not in a way that promised immediate change, but enough to show that what had been reached that night had not disappeared, that it had taken root in a place no one else had been able to reach before. And Caleb, a boy who had once existed entirely outside this world, became part of a story that neither he nor Richard could have imagined, not defined by where he came from, but by what he brought with him, something that didn't rely on status or background, something that didn't ask for permission to matter. Their lives, once separated by distance so vast it seemed impossible to cross, now moved forward with a connection that had formed in the most unexpected way, built not on obligation or design, but on a moment that neither of them fully understood when it first happened. But as with any story that challenges what we believe about the world, the questions don't disappear, they stay with us, waiting to be answered in our own way. What would you have done if you were in Richard Lawson's position, standing between everything you've built and something you can't explain? Would you have trusted that moment, or would you have shut it down before it had the chance to become something more? And what about Caleb, a boy with nothing to offer in the way the world usually measures value? Would you have seen him as a risk, or as something else entirely, something that doesn't fit neatly into the categories we rely on to make sense of people? Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a break-in, or a system that failed, or even a moment of unexpected connection. It was about the space between what we think matters and what actually does, about the difference between control and understanding, and about the ways in which life can shift when we allow something unfamiliar to reach us instead of pushing it away. The night that began with silence and suspicion didn't end with answers. It ended with something far more difficult to define, a change that continued to unfold long after the moment itself had passed. And if there's anything this story leaves behind, it's a reflection, one that asks you to look at the world a little differently, to consider the possibility that what we overlook might hold more value than what we prioritize, that what we dismiss might carry meaning we haven't yet learned to recognize. Because sometimes, the people with nothing, the ones we least expect, the ones who move through life unnoticed, have the most to give. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts below, and if you believe kindness still matters in today's world, consider subscribing for more stories like this.